Good evening, Principal, colleagues, honoured guests. My name is Mervyn Frost. I'm head of the War Studies Department, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for the 2012 Laughton Naval History Lecture by Professor Andrew Lambert. Before asking the Principal to introduce our speaker this evening, I would just like to say a very few words about leadership and about the Laughton Naval History Unit that is led by Professor Lambert. It is quite a stunning success story. It is, from my point of view as head of War Studies, the very model of what a research unit should be. Every year it produces research-led teaching over a number of courses. There's a dedicated team of research PhD students working under Professor Lambert's guidance. There's an impressive stream of publications. And then, of course, there are the public engagements. In one academic year, I counted them up this afternoon just to check that I was correct. Professor Lambert gave 30 public lectures up and down the country and abroad on one or another topic of naval history. A truly impressive record that I don't think is beaten by anyone, certainly not in our department at present. So this is the kind of leadership that he offers us as scholars in war studies, and I think that there's no one to whom people turn more often when wanting facts about British naval history and wanting sound analysis, and you will have proof of what I'm saying later this evening. But with that, let me hand over to the Principal, Professor Sir Rick Traynor.
Thank you very much, Mervyn. And good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of King's College London, and more to the point, to introduce Andrew. Now, introducing Andrew is a slightly intimidating task. I knew it was going to be, but then when I did a bit of homework in preparation for this occasion, I was more and more intimidated as I went along. Andrew has taught in a number of institutions, University of the West of England, Royal Naval College at Greenwich and at Sandhurst, but happily he's been here for many years, where he also gained his PhD. We've already heard from Mervyn about his round of teaching and lecturing activities and his PhD supervision. I'm really staggered by his research output. He modestly says in the relevant part of our website that he studies the naval and strategic history of the British Empire between the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War. But of course, he's defined that very broadly, and the number of his publications is absolutely staggering. My rough count is that counting his new book, there are 15 books in print, including a biography of Nelson, of course, many other subjects. He's edited or co-edited 5 volumes, and I didn't even attempt to count the number of articles and book chapters. I think dozens is the only way I can characterize the output. And as Mervyn has said, Andrew has not been a person who has confined himself to this broad range of academic activities. He is, in the very best sense of that word, a tele-don. And he's not someone who's confined his outreach in that sense to cozy places, studies with well-banked fires in the background and so on. Many of you, like me, will have seen him broadcasting from Baffin Island or from the Juan Fernandez Islands. And I treasure Andrew's account of mosquitoes who have apparently been dormant for millions of years coming out to greet him as he ventured on the first of those destinations. My favorite example of his outreach and his assiduous and effective promotion of naval history and of King's College London dates to the 21st of October 2005. As many of you will know, that was the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. And with perfect timing, He mounted the pulpit, no less, in Burnham Thorpe Church in Norfolk, where Nelson's father was rector at the time of his birth, to give a bicentenary lecture. Now, I have to confess, the one part of this introduction that leaves me not so much staggered as queasy is the subject of tonight's lecture. Because as a dual national, I'm bound to have mixed feelings, not so much by the title of the new book, The Challenge, Britain Against America in the Naval War of 1812, but by the particular wording of his title, the title of the lecture, Taking the President and Burning the White House, the War of 1812 at the Bicentenary. But notwithstanding that, please join me in welcoming Andrew.
Thank you very much, both Rick and Mervyn, for that splendid introduction. I'd like to thank my publishers, Faber, for their support of this event, and for everybody in the War Studies office who's made it happen, made it possible. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening with my family, my friends, my colleagues, my students, former students, and indeed many other people who it'll be my pleasure to get to know. We're celebrating 10 years of the Laughton Naval History Unit and a new book as well. So we have a lot to discuss. We have a relatively succinct time in which to discuss it. But I want to start off with something that happened not 200 years ago, but only a decade ago, when a British Prime Minister decided it was entirely appropriate to apologize to the President of the United States for burning the White House. It's essential when we do this to remember that history is a purely cultural construction, and that if you have no culture, it's easy to construct new history. The apology was not only seriously misconceived, but also completely wasted. Neither the apologist nor the recipient were in the least aware of who had started the War of 1812 or how it had finished. They were standing in the building that had been burned, and that, of course, gave them a certain frisson. I'm given to understand that when you go on the tour, they will show you a few bits with scorch marks, but be that as it may. This was a war that started not in Britain, but in America, and it ended in a way that the Americans had not perhaps anticipated. The British were not burning the White House for fun, although I'm sure they were amused to do so. They were burning it in revenge for an American attack on a building of similar standing, if not similar eminence, in what is now Toronto. The Americans had burned the public buildings of what was then called York, and this was a revenge attack. The American version of this war has long existed in American history, in American popular culture. It's always known as the Second War of Independence, and while this seems a rather strange thing for a war that you start yourself by invading somebody else's country, there is a deeper point to this, which I will get back to before we end. There is something of the War of Independence about this. It's not like the previous War of Independence, but it does have a very strong independence character to it. What is curious is that even at the Bicentenary, the great majority of Americans who know about the War of 1812 know that they won it. It's one of the many wars that they won, and it was indeed about fending off the dreadful British who were seeking to reimpose their empire over their new republic. This is despite the efforts of some very fine American and Canadian historians to change the picture slightly and to stress that this was a war of two halves, and indeed at least two different versions. The one version that has never been written for the last 180 years is the British version. The British have been rather concerned with other things. The last major British historian to write on this war died in 1829, the year that this college was founded. So we need to realize that it's been a long time since somebody looked at this war again from the British perspective. And that's very much what I've tried to do in this book. And hopefully we can start to move on. We need to consider, I think, what this war was about, why it began, and of course how it concluded. But above all, for the Bicentenary, we need to think what this war means to us today, because the past lives only in the present, as Nietzsche would have it, and I think that he was right. We need to begin with two men who really shaped the way this war is fought. I was going to talk about Thomas Jefferson, but that would take me off on a bit of a rant, and so I'm going to talk about Napoleon, who really is the architect of this war. Napoleon's intervention in American politics, in the politics of Europe, and his construction of an incessant war against the British and against almost anybody else shaped the context in which the War of 1812 occurs, and it also explains why most in Britain don't ever think about the War of 1812. There really were more important things to do in 1812 than fight the Americans. The other man who matters is Horatio Nelson, and the principal very kindly referred to the Bicentenary lecture I gave at Burnham Thorpe, and as a Norfolk man, it was a great feeling to be there with so many of my friends, family, and others in that very special place. But Nelson had died giving the British command of the ocean. He'd given them the ability to sustain their war against Napoleon, despite Napoleon's overwhelming military power and his endless success in continental military conflicts. It was Nelson that shaped the nature of that war. It was a war between the land and the sea, between sea power and continental power. Two forms of strength which could not finally get to grips with each other in a decisive way. Britain depended on the sea for her security, her prosperity, and her power, and this would shape the way Britain and America interacted. Napoleon was desperate for the Americans to join the war because he could see they had a lot of seafarers, a lot of ships, and they would be very useful allies in his war against the British. And there were some in America, not that many, who certainly saw Napoleon as the answer to their problems. But his efforts proved more successful through the flaws in American decision-making than through their decisive quality. He secured his object of American intervention just at the very moment when the war turned against him. As he marched into Russia, the Americans decided it was time to march into Canada because the British would be rather busy and nobody would notice. As you know, it didn't work out well for Napoleon, but Napoleon's war with Russia shapes the War of 1812 absolutely decisively. If you write about the 1812 war and you don't get into Russia, you've missed the whole logic of the war, I think, and it's very important not to do so. It was then left, once Napoleon had failed in Russia, for Nelson's colleagues, and especially his protégés, to turn the British war against America into a success, and we'll see how that works. I want to start with something that happened in 1803, as you'll probably notice. Becoming continental. In 1803, Napoleon sold a very large section of the continental North American landmass to the United States for about 2 cents an acre. This is called a very good land deal. But it had a fundamental effect on the nature of the United States. What had been initially a largely maritime, eastern seaboard economic activity is now shifting its focus inland, and it began to adopt different attitudes towards its future. President Thomas Jefferson was very keen to build a new kind of state, and he saw this as a great opportunity. The core narrative of the American identity seamlessly shifts from the ocean to the land. The focus, instead of being eastward, is westward. America was becoming land-hungry, expansionist, and it was bent on the conquest, one way or another, of the land of the Native Americans, the Spanish, and why not the British as well. The origins of a manifest destiny were certainly being laid. This was God's new kingdom, and it would be granted everything it wished for. Between 1803 and 1807, the United States made a fortune as the last major neutral carrier on the world ocean, supplying food and stores to the British, the French, and anybody else who had any money. Then, in 1807, the British and the French settled down to a serious economic war, a total economic war. The Orders in Council of the British and the Berlin Decrees of Napoleon said that if you traded with us, you can't trade with them. If you trade with them, you are our enemy, and that applied on both sides. The Americans were now in a double bind. They couldn't trade with either side without falling victim to the alternative. This economic war was for keeps. Whoever lost the war was going to lose the big war in Europe. So the Americans were the last neutrals, and being the last neutrals, they tended to get the short end of the stick in diplomatic and strategic terms. At the same time, the British were desperate to maintain the strength of their navy for very obvious reasons. It was the only way they could keep the French out of England. As a result, the Navy relied on impressing sailors at sea to reinforce the Navy. And some of these impressments clearly took men who were on American merchant ships, and some of those men may even have been Americans, although the figures suggest that less than half of them were. For the British, the impressment of British-born sailors was a natural right, and you couldn't alienate your nationality. You couldn't become an American by going to America. You had to be born in America. Under British law, under American law, things were different. There's clearly a dispute there of the kind which occupies our courts this very day about who we can send where to be tried by who. This all reached something of a climax. Oh dear, gone the wrong way. On the 22nd of June 1807, when two deserters from the Royal Navy were apprehended on board a US warship in American coastal waters. The interception of the USS Chesapeake by HMS Leopard was a serious flashpoint. The British admiral had perhaps exceeded his authority. The Americans were obliged to hand over the deserters. These men had deserted from a British warship in an American port and signed on to an American warship. The American government refused to hand them over. The British took them by force. At the very same time, Napoleon finally defeated the Russians at the Battle of Eylau. And as a result, the British were unable to back this action. They had to focus all their attention on the European theatre. Their expeditionary force, which they might have sent to North America, had to go to Copenhagen instead to take away the Danish navy. As ever, Napoleon shifts the focus back to Europe by something quite dramatic. The British stood back from this, they apologized, and eventually they handed the men back, apart from one of them who they'd already hung. Desertion is a serious offense in the face of the enemy, particularly when you insult the officers of your ship as you leave. That, I think, was the point that got the men hanging. Down to 1811, tension was high, and the United States Navy was very keen to restore its honor. It felt that the Chesapeake Incident had been a humiliation. And this man, Captain John Rogers, the leading figure of the seagoing American Navy, was desperate to recover America's naval honor. And on the 14th of May, 1811, his flagship, the USS President, a very big and powerful vessel, picked a fight with a very small British ship sloop, the Little Belt, which, funnily enough, had been taken from the Danes at Copenhagen in 1807. Having shot the British ship to pieces, the next morning he realized his mistake and he apologized profusely. But he did rather feel that the Americans had got their revenge. They'd put one over the haughty British, and that would be fine. At this time, the American government of President James Madison, Republican administration, was beginning to lose popularity, and it was suffering. And Madison was well aware that he needed some reinforcements to vote him back into office at the next election. And he linked up with a group called the War Hawks, a group of young politicians in Congress who were desperate to extend America's frontiers, to remove the threat of the Indian nations in the north and the south, the Spanish in Florida, and the British in Canada. Whether they wanted the lands of these peoples or not, they certainly wanted to push them beyond where they stood at this time. Madison links up with these people, and with their support, indeed with their leverage, he declares war in June. The American casus belli was the British Orders in Council, the economic war measures which were limiting American trade with France. By the time the Americans declared war on this basis, the British had repealed that legislation, so it was no longer an issue. They then switched to the claim of the impressment of British seafarers, and American seafarers as well, which had not been part of the reason for war. It was quite clear they were keen on a war and weren't particularly bothered what they were going to fight about. The War of 1812, of course, didn't begin when the British and the Americans started fighting. It began when the Americans invaded Florida, which belonged to Spain. Spain was entirely ambivalent in all of this. It was rather busy because that man Napoleon had put an army into their country and his brother was now their king. But the attempt to conquer Florida failed. American strategy in the war was fairly straightforward. They would invade Canada, they would occupy Canada, and perhaps the British would then make some concessions and they might give it back, or one rather suspects they weren't going to give it back. Ex-President Jefferson said it's a mere matter of marching, we'll turn up, we'll raise the flag, and everybody will say, well, I suppose we're all Americans now. It didn't turn out like that. The population of Canada in those days was dominated by two communities, the Francophone Canadians, who were not Republicans, they were Royalists, and they preferred King George to George Washington, and the Anglophone Canadians, who were all of those people who got tarred and feathered and thrown out of the United States in 1782. So they weren't very keen on becoming Americans either. And with the support of a small British garrison and a significant contribution by the native Confederacy in the north, led by an outstanding chief, Tecumseh, the American invasions at Detroit and on the Niagara frontier were thrown back in confusion. In fact, all of the American invasions of Canada in the War of 1812 failed. Not far from the frontier, the New York militia refused to cross the frontier. The army did cross but got thrown back. 3 years running, the American invasion of Canada fails. The Americans, however, win a battle on Lake Erie, the one down at the south center, which allows them to cross the lake briefly. And in 1814, they won an important battle on Lake Champlain at Plattsburgh, further over to your right. So the war on the frontier was essentially a stalemate. American invasions of Canada failed. The one serious British invasion of America failed as well. This puts the emphasis back to the one place where the American government was not expecting to have to fight at sea. The American government, since 1800, had built no new ships. It had spent very little on the Navy, and it did not expect the Navy to do anything. The American Navy was small. It was a minnow by comparison with the enormous power of the Royal Navy of this period. 7 or 8 frigates, a few sloops and gunboats. The British had over 100 line of battleships in commission. They had an enormous fleet. Surely the American fleet could do nothing. Of course, they ended up doing rather more than that. The first act of the war was an attack by John Rodgers in the President on HMS Belvedere, which you can see scampering away with the wind behind her. That was the first the British knew that war had been declared. In those days, you didn't declare war by a telex message, you fired a gun at somebody. Shortly after that, the American war took on a very new character. The USS Constitution found and engaged HMS Guerriere, a British frigate, a rather smaller one, but a British frigate, in single combat, and won the battle. The Americans had taken on the British, they defeated them in a fair fight, apparently, and they proved their point. For the American Navy, this was a blessed result. This was revenge for all of the insults the British had ever given to them, and also for all of the insults the Republican government had given them over the previous 12 years. They really could now thumb their noses at James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and say perhaps the United States did need a navy after all. This was an important battle, and it generated American pictures of naval battles, the first, and this is a very important one. Captain Isaac Hull was very proud of his battle. He had the pictures painted, he had a portrait painted, and it was quite handy because his uncle William had lost the battle at Detroit, so it sort of saved the family's honor as well. You can see he's rather pleased with himself. Shortly after that, his contemporary, Stephen Decatur, who was the United States' real War of 1812 hero, in his ship, the United States, again quite an important name, took on and defeated HMS Macedonian in a battle which was characterized mostly by the stupidity and indeed the ocular defects of the British captain, John Carden, who should have been cashiered for fighting a battle against a much bigger ship. And finally, off the coast of Brazil, the Constitution, under a different captain, captured HMS Java in a distinguished battle in which both sides fought brilliantly, but the bigger ship inevitably won the day. By this stage, the Americans weren't painting the pictures of the battles, the British were painting them, because the British had realized that when you're outnumbered 3-2, heroic defeat is a valuable polemical device. This is the British art of heroic defeat. The much smaller ship has been beaten by the much bigger ship. There's no disgrace in that. That wasn't the way the Americans told the story. These ships were both called frigates, and therefore it was a fair fight. It was not a fair fight, but it didn't matter much. So the British generate heroic defeat, the Americans generate a success story, because that's the only story where the Americans can say they're winning. They've lost the war on the land. They don't really have a very good reason for fighting, but at least they can win some naval battles, and that is Britannia's element. If you can beat the British at sea, you've really proved your point. Here's William Bainbridge, a rather grim old fellow who won that last battle. By the end of 1812, the British had lost 3 frigate battles, they'd won several military engagements, but critically, they knew that Napoleon had been beaten. The British response to the American declaration of war had been to send an admiral to command the station, whose main instructions were about settling the peace. The British couldn't believe the Americans were serious, and they couldn't believe that when they heard the orders in council had been revoked, they would carry on fighting. So Admiral Warren was sent out to solve the problem. He knew about diplomacy, he'd been an ambassador, and if not, he would have to fight them. But there weren't too many ships to spare because the Navy was fully stretched, and so for the rest of 1812, all the British could do really was try and protect their trade and try and stop the Americans doing any more damage to their economic lifeline. The real nub of this war turned out to be command of the Atlantic, the ability for the British to use the Atlantic as an economic lifeline to bring goods from the New World to the Old World, to keep their trade with the West Indies going. The Americans sent their navy out, but their navy was mostly engaged in combats with the British. The real damage to British shipping was done by American privateers, licensed private enterprise vessels running on a profit basis. No prize, no pay. American privateering, up to 600 vessels, mostly out of Baltimore, New York, and Boston, was initially hugely successful. Nearly 1,200 British merchant vessels were captured. About 700 of them made it back to the United States. A significant dent in Britain's vast oceanic mercantile fleet. But the introduction of effective convoy, good intelligence, and aggressive patrolling got a grip on this American threat during 1813. Critically, on the 1st of June 1813, the United States Navy suffered 2 decisive defeats. Captain Stephen Decatur's squadron was driven into New London, Connecticut, and remained there for the rest of the war, where it posed no threat to the British. And later that day, the USS Chesapeake sailed from Boston with a mission to attack British military convoys taking troops and supplies into the Gulf of St. Lawrence to reinforce the army in Canada. This was where the Americans were under real pressure. They sent their navy out to save their army. Captain James Lawrence of the Chesapeake was a brave and brilliant officer who'd already captured a British ship in single ship action, but he had a lot more to prove. He'd just been made captain, he'd been given a big new command, and he got some very express orders to get out there and deal with the problem. He knew there was a British frigate waiting for him in Boston Bay. He didn't know precisely what kind of ship he was about to meet up with. His opponent that day, HMS Shannon, was a ship of almost exactly the same size and armament as the Chesapeake. This was a very fair fight. The Americans had a few more men on board, but in the end, that wasn't the decisive factor. It was commanded by Captain Philip Brooke, a Suffolk gentleman who'd spent 7 years fine-tuning his ship's company, their guns, their drill, and in the process really created the modern way in which navies do business. He'd been looking for this battle all his life. This was the defining moment of his existence. He waited for the Chesapeake to come out, and then he led the Chesapeake out to sea, so they were out of sight of the American mainland and out of range of the American gunboat flotilla in Boston Harbor. He then took in sail and waited for the American ship to come up and fight. Lawrence came up, and he overshot his target. Lawrence's plan was to bring up alongside the British ship, engage them, as they say, yardarm to yardarm at minimum fighting distance, and exchange fire until one or other was defeated. But this, in an age when ships don't have brakes, this required some very fine tuning of the sail, and he came in with too much way through the water. He's probably coming in at about just over 2 miles an hour, and he needed to be coming in at least half a knot slower. At the last minute he realized this, but it was too late, and he overshot at the Shannon. This picture shows the moment at which the battle began. The Chesapeake, which is the ship on this side, is coming up alongside the Shannon. And as she does so, Brooke has ordered that his gunners will fire into the gun ports of the American ship. This is unprecedented. They're not aiming at the ship, they're aiming at the gun crews inside the ship. And as the aftermost gun on the Shannon bears on the foremost gun on the Chesapeake, that gun fires an 18-pound shot and a stand of grape shot through the American gun port, kills most of the gun crew, knocks the gun over. Within a minute, a full broadside of British projectiles have gone into the gun ports of the Chesapeake. Most of her gun crews, certainly the forward division, have been wiped out, and their commanding officer is dead. On the upper deck, similar damage is done by the carronades of the Shannon, which kill or wound all of the officers and quartermasters standing around the American ship's wheel, destroy the wheel, and cut critical parts of the rigging. Inside 1 minute, the American ship has been fatally wounded. This is fire of uncommon precision in this period. At this point, the Chesapeake, which is luffed up into the wind to try and reduce speed, loses control and swings out of control and opens her stern, which is literally just glass and balsa wood, to the fire of the Shannon. And further broadsides are fired into the after part of the ship, doing more damage to the gun crews on both decks. The Chesapeake then crashes back into the Shannon, and at this point, Philip Brooke, who's been directing the battle with precision and trying to avoid hand-to-hand combat because it doesn't show any particular skill, realizes that the American upper deck is almost empty and the ships are in contact. So he leads a boarding party of about 25 men over the rail onto the upper deck of the Chesapeake. And at that point, the American crew remaining are both limited and demoralized. They're driven below deck and forced to surrender. James Lawrence has been mortally wounded. He's been carried below, issuing the United States Navy's motto, "Don't give up the ship." It was a bit late, they already had. He then asked them to blow the ship up, which fortunately they didn't. That would have been somewhat ungallant. At this point, Brooke stops his men, who have got their blood up and are quite happy to kill anybody they find. He stops all the fighting, gets everybody calmed down. 3 men come down from the rigging of the Chesapeake and attack Brooke. One of them knocks his hat off, and the second one hits him over the head with a cutlass and opens his skull up to the brains. These 3 men are all British deserters, and they're killed by Brooke's crew. Brooke is left stunned, unconscious on the deck with his head open and his brain still throbbing. He survives because nobody does very much with him. They clean him up and give him some rest. Nobody tries any procedures to try and save his life. They just see what will happen. This is the bloodiest naval battle of its type probably ever fought, and it's also the shortest. It was all over in 11 minutes. These battles normally take 2 hours, but when you have 2 officers with very good crews who are desperate to fight, things can get settled pretty quickly. 6 days later, the Shannon led the Chesapeake into Halifax Harbour, Nova Scotia, and the captain of the Shannon on that day was Provost William Wallace, who was a Halifax-born officer who was commanding the ship as Brooke was unfit for duty. This was the moment when the war for the British turned. All of a sudden, that dismal run of defeats had become a glorious success. George Cruikshank celebrated it by turning the usual caricatures of the French losing a naval battle into one of the Americans. And there are a few stock French characters in here, including the rather scary-looking ones. But the British tar on this side, giving Uncle Sam a boot in the breeches and kicking him overboard, I think sums up the way the British rather enjoyed this war. Here is Brooke standing with his naval gold medal. He was the only officer given a gold medal for winning a single ship action. This was a unique moment. He was made a baronet, was given a gold medal, and the flag he's standing on is, I hasten to add, the Stars and Stripes. But he had lowered it in battle, so he was perhaps entitled. A very modest man, he never went to sea again in a combat command, but he lived until 1840, and he's the ancestor of all modern naval service. He created a new way of running navies. After this battle, the Americans couldn't win. It was a question when they recognized that they'd lost. One of their officers, David Porter, took his ship, the USS Essex, into the Pacific on a major raid, but he was cornered in Valparaiso Harbor by Captain James Hilliard on HMS Phoebe, and he lost his ship. He managed to write a splendid account of his defeat, in which it made it look like he'd probably won morally, and he was the architect of a whole new American way of seeing the Pacific. He created the American Pacific that will be inhabited by Richard Henry Dana and above all by Herman Melville. He creates a new way of seeing this different ocean. So Porter is part of the literary fight back by the Americans. They've lost the battle, but they haven't given up on winning the story. After the Shannon battle, the British sit down to blockade the American coast. They tighten that blockade, they squeeze the Americans economically, and the Americans come up with some interesting new ways of fighting. The Yankee torpedo is what we would call an improvised explosive device. It's a bomb in a ship, floated alongside Thomas Hardy's flagship. Thomas Hardy, very calm, gentle fellow, was furious. They'd blown up some of his officers and killed one of his protégés. So he told the locals if they did that again, he'd burn their town down. They didn't. John Bull is here showing the Americans what he thinks of their weapons by turning the other cheek. Having got a grip on the American coast, destroyed the American economic activity, which flowed along that coast and out to sea, the British then relied on another one of Nelson's protégés, Admiral George Cockburn, to launch a series of devastating raids in the Chesapeake Bay area. This was the area where the Americans who voted for the war lived. Men of Maryland and Virginia and the Carolinas had voted for this war, so the British carried the war to them. They knew this because, of course, American democracy meant that the division lists were public knowledge. So if your state voted for the war, the British were going to attack you. If they didn't, like the New England states, the British left you alone. All the British were doing in this war was what they were doing to the French anyway. They didn't find a new kind of way of fighting. They just put the Americans in with the rest of the enemy. By the middle of 1814, the United States was functionally bankrupt. It was disunited. The northern states wanted to end the war and leave it. And there was already, the British could see, a civil war brewing between the North and the South over fundamental issues of the economy and politics. Cockburn, seen here in his top boots with spurs on, with the public buildings behind him in flames, was the architect of, indeed, this outrage, and this outrage as well, and several others. He also destroyed the printing offices of the National Intelligencer, which had been printing very rude things about him, comparing him to the devil and not to the devil's advantage. He went there and took out the compositor's box and destroyed all of the letter C, so they couldn't. Nelson's protégés mostly had a sense of humor. At the same time, the Washington suburb, as it is now, of Alexandria, was captured by a small British naval expedition, and you can see here John Bull making the Americans' hair stand on end while his men carry away the plunder. British landed at Baltimore. There's a little battle at North Point. Eventually they decided that they weren't going to capture Baltimore. There were too many people there. And the war then actually came to an end. The Treaty of Ghent ends the war on Christmas Eve, 1814. What are the terms of the war ending? They're exactly what the Americans have been offered in June 1812. Status quo ante. Nothing has changed. The war ends exactly where it started. There is no shift at all. The British don't ask for anything much. The Americans don't demand anything. And all of that stuff about the impressing of sailors, not mentioned. Maritime belligerent rights, not mentioned. This was something the Americans could have had in 1812 or 1813. But while the news was crossing the Atlantic, the USS President slipped out of New York Harbor under the command of Stephen Decatur and was tracked down and captured by HMS Endymion, commanded by Captain Henry Hope. And this is a superb action of great skill on the part of both officers, a great full day's chase under sail. And they fought under full sail as well, which was very unusual, into the dusk. The president was eventually captured and taken back to Britain, where it became Britain's major trophy of the war. The USS Constitution fought yet another battle from which it emerged victorious, which becomes the basis of an American version of the war, the idea of an American victory, widely published. But the truth, of course, was, as HMS Shannon, seen here resting in the Medway as late as 1844, demonstrated, the British had indeed won the naval war. They also built a replica of the President, which became the headquarters of the Royal Naval Reserve in London, which is why HMS President is still in full commission as a stone frigate and the headquarters of the London Naval Reserve. By contrast, the USS Constitution has been preserved as the flagship of America's successful war. In military terms, the war had been utterly futile. The Americans had won nothing, the British had won nothing, they'd gone exactly back where they'd started. Fortunately, not too many people got killed. More people were killed in one of the great bastions at the Battle of Borodino than died in the entire War of 1812. By Napoleonic standards, this was quite a small war, which I think is a good thing. By 1815, however, America had achieved something. It had become independent culturally. Those American artists and writers, poets like Francis Scott Key, writers like Washington Irving, and very soon James Fenimore Cooper, were creating a new kind of American culture, one that wasn't a knockoff of European culture, that wasn't a kind of Anglo-French mix. This was American. It wasn't looking at the sea, it was looking at the interior. It was marching up the Hudson River westwards. The Hudson River School of Artists were painting a new kind of America, a sublime, primeval America, which didn't depend on European models. You didn't need a classical statue in the back to have a great landscape. The sea was fading from view. The land was becoming dominant. The United States was becoming a continental state. Everybody knows the defining American novels of this period. It was Fenimore Cooper who wrote the ones that sold. Melville, the author of The Sea, his last great book, Moby Dick, was a complete commercial flop. America had lost interest in the ocean by the 1850s. It was much happier marching into Mexico and taking territory from the Mexicans. But hidden beneath this new vision of America were the profound divisions between the North and the South that would surface in 1861. A South led by Andrew Jackson, the victor of Horseshoe Bend when the Southern Indian Confederacy was defeated, and New Orleans, when the people of Louisiana kept control of their slaves. This was a different kind of America to the America of the North, and these two cultures would ultimately fall to blows. These festering divisions explode around a fort in Charleston Harbor built to keep the British out. Because like the whole of the eastern seaboard of the United States, the main consequence of this war was the fortification of America's coastline. All of those American generals who fought the Civil War grew up building forts. From Maine all the way down to the tip of Florida, you won't find a decent American harbor without at least one 19th century fortress in it, usually more. The American coast had been bastioned against the British for the entirety of the 19th century, a vast, costly demonstration of who won the war. It was written in stone on the American coast. The results were clear. Canada remained independent of America because the Royal Navy remained dominant in the Atlantic. The British had secured their aims, and a century later, the three great Anglophone nations of the North Atlantic would come together to deal with greater and more unpleasant threats, threats that more nearly matched the nature of Napoleon's menace in 1812. They would shape the 20th century in two major wars and another major extended form of conflict, which is still bearing a legacy with us today. The message of the war was that Britain, America, and what is now Canada had far more in common than they had apart. This was why in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson was so determined that he would not allow the German interest to prevail in the United States, because he didn't want to be like James Madison and back the wrong horse in the next World War. As a result, Britain, America, Canada, and their friends built a very different world. And it's a world in which we don't need to apologize for what happened in 1812, or indeed 1814. We need to be aware that the past is a constantly moving opportunity to reconsider how we got here. It's here that matters, but we might as well tell the truth about how we got here. because that serves us better than mythology. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Before I thank Andrew, which I will do at the end of the proceedings, he's agreed to take a whole set of questions.
Maybe if you...
Anybody want to be?
Microphone is going.
Yeah, I wonder if I could make two observations about the war myself. There are lots of wars or lots of conflicts in history where one protagonist appears to more or less drum up a legal argument to defend what they act or justify what they are actually doing. I put it to you, and perhaps you'd like to comment, that the war we're talking about is a war that actually has three legal issues. The issue of the paper blockade, the war contraband, the impressment, and so forth, all of which were, unlike in other wars, is what I'm saying, were issues which could have been decided judicially. And therefore, I think there's a certain uniqueness in this war for that. And if I may make the second observation, the historiography of the war published in Canada creates another myth, does it not, which omits even the participation of the United Kingdom, believing it's entirely the Canadian part-time territorial militia who won the war.
Thank you very much for that. Yet, if I can take those in reverse order, the Canadian mythology is part of the usual nation-building mythology that all countries go through at certain stages in their existence. And modern Canadian historians have certainly moved on from that. But there was, I think, a need for Canada to own its part in the war. It was part of the creation of Canada, and it happened at around the same time as the Confederation in the 1860s. Canada becomes a nation, it's given a history, and that history isn't necessarily hugely accurate, but it's hugely useful. It serves the purpose because it says Francophone Canadians, Anglophone Canadians, Native Americans, we all fought this war, we have a defined enemy, therefore we can become a people. And it's a very large part of how people define themselves, not by what they are, but by what they're not, and indeed who they're not. The legal side of the arguments about impressment, the blockades of the Orders in Council, the problem for the Americans was that the French were treating them at least as badly as the British, if not worse, because Napoleon quite often promised he would stop attacking their ships, but carried on doing so. The British never promised anything, they just carried on attacking the ships. But American statesmen of the Republican persuasion were certainly predisposed to take Napoleon at face value. And as everybody who's studied that period will know, the one thing Napoleon should never be taken at as face value, he never meant a word. He said if only the Americans had fought properly, they would have done some damage to the British. As he was sailing down to St. Helena, he was confronted with the news the Americans had finally signed. He said, well, they didn't try hard enough, maybe next time. Napoleon certainly saw the Americans as future allies, but then when the Royal Navy has you locked up in St. Helena, you're not coming back. And who did they send to keep him in check down there? George Cockburn, straight from burning the White House to putting the emperor under control. So the British are saying something about the way the world is going to work in the future. The sea belongs to the British. They won't discuss those issues with the Americans because they won't discuss them with the Europeans either. At the Treaty of Vienna, the British are saying, look, if you raise those issues about maritime belligerent rights, we're going home. We're not going to be part of any process that interferes with our ability to use the sea as we think fit. British law is the only law that counts at sea. When the Americans have their civil war, whose law do they use to impose a blockade on the South? British practice. If you want to win the war using economic means, you need British practice. If you oppose British practice, you're quite clearly not going to use the sea as a strategic instrument. And this is the argument the Americans are making. You're using this in a way that's disadvantageous to us. And as the British point out, if we can't do this, we can't do anything. If the American position holds, the British have to surrender to Napoleon. This is why they fought the Russians and the Danes in 1801, and again in 1807, and it's why they continue fighting Napoleon, and it's why they drive the peace process in Europe in 1814 and 15 in a particular way. That is the bedrock of British power. They don't have any other tools to play with, so they have to fight for them. But legally, it's questionable. But in war, the legal issues disappear. Force majeure takes over, and the British have the force.
Thank you. Sir. Yeah, gentleman with the...
Thank you very much. Just as we were waiting for you, I had a dip into your book, and I encountered an enthralling narrative. And I found myself reading your account of the encounter between the Chesapeake and the Shannon. And my recollection was that I think it was the Americans demonized, among others, a black bugler, whom I assume was one of ours, because it was theirs, was it?
One of theirs.
I see. Because, in fact, we had quite a number of black people, as you know, on our ships. And I wondered if there was, in this war, a component of slavery, because if we take the American leadership, so many of them were slave owners, and they, at the treaty which ended the American War of Independence, they made quite excessive demands as to the value of their slaves, and wanting that all the blacks who'd actually joined the British Army should be sent back. Now, the interesting thing is that General Carleton, who was in control of these people, when he was told that he had to send them back, he said, "That's against my honor as a soldier and a gentleman," and shipped them off quickly in Royal Naval ships to Canada. So was there a slavery and a colour component in this war?
Yes, there certainly was. The black bugler in question was the Chesapeake bugler, and the complaint was that he didn't blow his bugle hard enough, and that as a result the American crew didn't know they had to come up on the upper deck to fend off the boarders. They also invented a Portuguese boatswain who they also blamed for not doing his duty. So there's quite clearly an element of passing the buck, as we would say in this case. Anybody who wasn't identifiably a white American was fair game. During the raids in the Chesapeake, one of the key resources for the British was the very large number of slaves who abandoned their existence and fled to the British, many of whom, the adult males, were enlisted in what became the Royal Colonial Marines. And if you want to frighten a Southern American in 1814, you send him a disciplined regiment of black men in redcoats with muskets. If you've ever wanted to understand why the American South was so heavily militarized that it fought so successfully in 1861, you have to understand that the prospect of another British invasion using African American soldiers and West Indian soldiers was the mortal threat to the American South. The day after the Battle of New Orleans, when the British had been defeated and were retreating back to their ships, General Andrew Jackson's troops were not pursuing the British, they were rounding up the slaves. Because the whole point of the battle was to preserve the slave economy. It was not to defeat or otherwise the British. The British were in many ways bit part players in that drama. And there was again at the end of this war an unseemly kind of argument about the value of this property. Most of the African Americans that the British were responsible for at the end of this war ended up in Trinidad. So the African population of Trinidad largely stems from this period. And they're people who left the United States and servitude, because once you tread the deck of a Royal Navy warship, you are no longer a slave. Slavery was not recognized by the Royal Navy. So there was a very strong element, and the reason for those fortifications was not just to protect the United States, but to protect a certain kind of United States in the South. And that was why so many of those forts were on those southern harbors, all the way through the Chesapeake down into Florida. So there was a very strong element of race in this war, not just with the slaves, but also with the Native Americans. The people who lost this war were, to an extent, the people of New England and the North, the Native Americans in particular. This was the last time that the Native Americans were able to think about themselves as a group having some kind of identity outside the United States, Canada, Spanish America. and they lost this war very seriously. By 1830, Andrew Jackson had pushed them to the other side of the Mississippi and begun this miserable process of herding them into corrals and essentially allowing them to disappear. So this is a war which has many dimensions, but that dimension must always be remembered, that the real losers of this war are not the British or the Americans. It's the native people who really suffer in this war. As a result of this war, plantation slavery doubles for the next 25 years.
The gentleman at the back there.
Yes, thank you for an excellent talk. Over the years, I've come into contact and worked with a number of Canadians and have always tried to find an opportunity to bring this war up and say, what about our fantastic joint effort in 1812 against the Americans? And it's interesting because a lot of them have a sort of vague, they're of my sort of generation, and they have a vague idea about the war, but no particular strong attachment to it or recollection of there even being a very good film about it. And when do you think it came about that its power as a foundation myth for the Canadians weakened or descended to this sort of state now?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. It's remained, I think, a fundamental part of the American sense of their history for very obvious reasons. This is their big war early in the 19th century, but for the British, it just disappears almost immediately. William James, the one British historian of this war, died in 1829, and interest in the war was already over. The market was filled. The Canadians revive it in the mid to late 19th century when America is still seen as a reason for getting together. The Americans are down there. We haven't got enough troops to defend the country. How are we going to pull together? So in many ways, it's a political rallying cry. Remember, this has happened before. These guys did cross the frontier once. They did try and invade our country. We need to use this. But it's hard to sustain that myth. And in a polite nation like Canada, probably the most polite nation on earth, the last thing you want to do is remind your neighbors again and again that last time they crossed the frontier, you kicked them out. So I think the Canadians sort of gradually, they don't need to talk about that anymore because those days are done. The Americans are not going to do that again. America has occupied Canada in different ways, and now with the Canadian dollar being so strong, I think a bit of reverse engineering may be happening anytime soon. Not that the Canadians would say that. So I think it's lost its power because there are more important things now to talk about in the creation of a Canadian identity. Canada's role in the two Great Wars, I think, has triumphed over this because the contribution is much larger. It's engaged a much wider spread of the population. And it's given Canada a history in which the sacrifice of Canadians as Canadians in Canadian units under Canadian command is the issue, rather than this kind of slightly odd position of being part of a British army, but occasionally part of a Canadian army. The World Wars give you something better. So it's not so much forgotten as replaced. If you want an identifier, there are better ones afterwards. So I think it's lost its allure for that reason. Thank you.
A last question, right at the back there.
Sorry, as a Canadian, I'd just like to say that I grew up in my mid-20s, so I know the Pierre Berton version of the War of 1812. Yeah. So the Battle of Lake Erie, the Battle of Lake Ontario, these are really what I grew up with. Yep. Laura Secord and all of that kind of thing. So I was just wondering where you see that aspect of the Naval War fitting into the greater Naval War. For example, I found out this morning they built 2 frigates in Lake Ontario that I'd never even heard about. The Pierre Berton never wrote about.
What I've done in the book is to look at the war on the Atlantic as the dominant war. But what happens for both the British and the Americans in naval terms is they're siphoning men off into the Lake War. For the Americans in particular, a very large proportion of their naval effort by the end of the war is on the lakes, because that's the decisive theatre for them. If the British can enter America overland down through the lake corridor, that will be decisive. But it's a stalemate. On Lake Ontario, the British build a ship as big as HMS Victory, HMS St. Lawrence, a 110-gun battleship. And the Americans build one just as big. And they're having a little arms race, which ends with 2 very big ships sitting around doing nothing. The Americans kept theirs until 1860 and took a photograph of it. The British sold theirs for firewood. It sort of goes away again quite quickly. But it's important, not because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen. And so it's the kind of the obverse of of the war. The war at sea ebbs and flows. The war on land, it's pretty static, and the lake wars really don't change that. The British win the land battles, the Americans win a couple of lake battles, and it sort of evens out, and everybody ends up where they started. It's the war on the Atlantic that really makes a difference. That's the one that breaks the American economy. When the war ends, the United States Treasury has no money. They can't actually pay the soldiers to fight. The soldiers that fought at New Orleans were paid by the Secretary for War out of his own pocket because he was a rich man, and the government might have some credit in the future. The United States was bankrupt. The burning of Washington led most Americans with any capital to take their money out of American stock and put it into British stock. You got the cash, you crossed the border, and you bought British government bonds in Canada. That's what all patriotic Americans were doing in late 1814. The Chinese weren't the first to do that. They're buying up American debt. It crossed the border in a very large amount, and the peace was very necessary. The British really were running out of money, but the Americans had already run out. So if you're playing these big stakes games, you need a very big pot of money. The sinews of war are money, money, and money. And the British had a lot more money. It wasn't a wise choice to fight them.
Well,
Thank you very much.
On that note, Andrew, could I draw the proceedings to a close? But before we drink, could I, on your behalf, thank Andrew for giving such a tour de force of a lecture in which he sets the global stage, the regional stage, discusses the politics, and then brings it all back down to the drama of the actual battles. I certainly was enthralled, and I know that you were too. So could we all thank Andrew for a very excellent lecture?
Ladies and gentlemen, there are refreshments at the end of the room.
And also, the book is there.
There may even be a copy.